I never thought that the moment I had dreamed of for years, my granddaughter's wedding, would begin with something as small and humiliating as a name tag. I had worked for decades, pinching every penny, saving carefully, making sacrifices no one ever really acknowledged, just so my family would never have to feel the same financial struggles I did. I wanted to make this wedding special, the kind of day my granddaughter would never forget. I wrote the checks, covered the catering, the flowers, the dresses, even the ridiculous ice sculpture her fiancé's family insisted on. I didn't complain once, even though inside I kept thinking of how many things I could have done for myself with that money, how many years of security it represented. But I told myself that family came first, and this was my way of showing love. Yet when I walked into the reception hall and looked down at the plastic badge hanging from my chest, I saw words that cut deeper than any insult ever had. It read, "The old lady who's paying for everything." First, I thought it must be a mistake. Surely someone had printed the wrong tag. I looked around at the tables where the other family members were sitting, laughing, chatting, sipping champagne as though this was all just an ordinary celebration, and I noticed their neat little tags with names and polite titles: Mother of the Bride, Best Man, Bride's Sister. None of them had anything crude or demeaning. Just me. Just the woman who had made this entire event possible, reduced to a punchline that stung worse with every glance. I swallowed my pride and tried to smile, but inside I was burning. I couldn't help replaying the countless times my family had dismissed me as though I were a walking wallet, a source of convenience rather than a person with feelings. I remembered the night my son called me, voice dripping with entitlement, saying, "Mom, it would mean so much if you helped us with this wedding. You know we can't afford something grand without you." He hadn't asked if I wanted to, he had assumed I would. And I had agreed like always. I never wanted to be the kind of mother or grandmother who said no. But standing there with that badge pressed against my chest, I realized that every sacrifice had been taken for granted, every effort rewritten as an obligation, and now I was mocked for it in front of everyone. I tried to tell myself not to make a scene, that this was her special day and I should keep quiet, but the humiliation was already gnawing at me. It wasn't just about the tag, it was the culmination of years of small slights, of being left out of decisions even though I paid for them, of hearing whispered jokes about how I was loaded, when the truth was that I had worked myself half to death just to have enough to spare. I thought of the countless overtime shifts, the meals I skipped, the vacations I never took. All of it was to build something for my family, and here I was introduced to strangers as though my only identity was the old lady who's paying. As the evening carried on, I noticed more things that chipped away at my composure. My granddaughter, radiant in her gown, barely glanced at me. She was swept up with her friends, with her new in-laws, with the photographers. I reminded myself that brides are always busy, but a part of me still ached when she walked past me twice without stopping, as though I were just another piece of decoration. My son and his wife were too busy showing off to their friends, parading around as though they had pulled off this wedding with their own efforts. They never once mentioned me to anyone, never once pointed me out with gratitude. And yet, when the bills had come, it was my account that had been drained. The bitterness grew heavier as I overheard snippets of conversation. Someone at the next table whispered, "Well, she's got the money, right? Better she spends it now before she's gone." Another laughed in response and I felt my face flush hot. Was that what they all thought of me? That I was just a ticking clock? A temporary resource to be emptied out before I died? I tried to laugh it off, but the tears prickled behind my eyes, and I had to excuse myself, pretending I needed to use the restroom just to catch my breath. Standing in front of the mirror, I studied my reflection. The lines on my face told the story of a life lived in hard work, in resilience, in giving without asking much in return. I had always told myself it was worth it, that my sacrifices made me strong, that I wasn't the kind of person who needed constant thanks. But looking at my tag, at the words someone had thought would be funny, I realized that I wasn't respected at all. I wasn't loved for my heart, I wasn't honored for my support. I was mocked for it. And then a deeper thought sank in. What if this had been intentional? What if someone, maybe even my daughter-in-law, had thought it would be amusing to put me in my place, to remind me that I wasn't truly part of the center of the celebration? She had never liked how involved I was, never liked that I had influence because I was funding so much. It wouldn't surprise me if she had orchestrated this. The thought made my chest tighten. not just with anger but with betrayal. When I finally returned to the reception, I felt different. I sat at my assigned table, silent, watching as the people I had supported for years carried on without me. Every laugh, every toast, every dance seemed to push me further to the edges, as though I were invisible except for the money I provided. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I began to see clearly that I had allowed myself to be treated like this, that I had given so much without ever demanding respect in return. For the first time in a long time, I felt something rising in me that wasn't just sadness. It was resolve. I sat there with the bitterness still stuck in my throat after seeing that humiliating name tag. And though I smiled politely for my granddaughter's sake, something inside me shifted. I realized in that very moment that they did not see me as family, as the woman who had poured her heart and soul into making sure everyone had what they needed, but rather as a walking checkbook with a pulse. For years I had been the one who quietly paid the bills when someone fell short, who covered tuition when promises were broken, who hosted dinners when holidays came around and nobody else had the time or willingness. I had taken pride in being dependable, but seeing that label slapped on me like a cruel joke made me wonder if all I had ever been was their safety net, their ATM, their background provider while they lived their lives freely and without gratitude. That thought kept echoing in my mind as I sat through speeches, toasts, and fake smiles, and I could feel my hands tightening around the napkin in my lap, trying to hold back the sting of tears because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. When the music started and the couples moved onto the dance floor, I excused myself and walked out to the hallway, taking off that name tag and staring at it under the soft yellow light. The words felt heavier than paper. They were an entire lifetime of my effort boiled down into one cruel joke. I wanted to tear it apart, but instead I tucked it into my purse because something inside me told me to hold on to it, that maybe this was not just an insult but a turning point. My daughter approached me after a while, clearly tipsy, laughing about the tag as if it were some harmless prank. She said, "Don't take it so seriously, Mom, it's just for laughs. Everyone knows you're generous." Her words stung worse than the tag itself because in her drunken tone I heard the truth. She genuinely saw me only as the source of money that kept everything afloat. I gave her a tight smile and told her I was fine, but in my head I was already making a decision that I never thought I'd make. That night when I got home, I poured myself a glass of water and sat in my kitchen replaying everything. The years of sacrifices flashed in my mind, working 2 jobs when my husband passed so that my children never had to go without, skipping vacations and new clothes so they could go to college, silently covering rent when one of them mismanaged money, and never once asking for anything in return but love and respect. Instead, I had become a joke, the old lady who pays for everything. I stayed up until dawn writing in my journal, my pen shaking as I put my feelings into words. And by the time the sun came up, I knew what had to be done. If my family only valued me for what I gave them, then I would stop giving. But not in silence. I would let them feel the weight of their cruelty the way I had felt it pressed into my chest that night. The next day, I made an appointment with my lawyer. He was surprised to see me so early, but when I explained that I wanted to update my will and financial arrangements, he listened carefully. I told him that my family would no longer be the sole beneficiaries of what I had built over my lifetime. Instead, I wanted my money to go to causes that mattered to me, to charities that helped struggling women, to organizations that supported children in need, to scholarships for students who worked hard but had no one to back them. As I spoke, I felt a strange calm wash over me because for the first time in years I was taking control, not just reacting to their needs. My lawyer nodded, telling me that it was well within my rights to restructure everything, and he guided me through the process patiently. With each signature I felt lighter, freer, almost as though I was shaking off invisible chains that had kept me tethered to ungrateful people who had mistaken obligation for love. Over the next few weeks, I kept my plans to myself while observing my family more closely. Their behavior confirmed everything I already knew. My granddaughter barely called except to ask if I had wired the next installment for her honeymoon. My daughter texted me about helping with a down payment on a bigger house, throwing in a half-hearted, "Love you, Mom," at the end like it was part of a script. Even my son, who had once been the closest to me, came by only to drop hints about needing help with his car loan. None of them asked how I was feeling after the wedding, whether I was lonely or happy. They just circled like vultures waiting for the next check to land in their hands. And every time I smiled, nodded, and said I would think about it, while deep inside I knew that I had already made my decision. They just didn't know what was coming. I found myself growing stronger as the weeks passed, no longer burdened by the guilt that had always made me say yes when I wanted to say no. I started going for walks again, joining a local community group where people actually appreciated my company, not my money. I even signed up to volunteer at a shelter, and the gratitude I saw in strangers' eyes filled me in a way my own family's dismissive words never had. Slowly, I started to realize that revenge wasn't always about fire and fury. It could also be about reclaiming your power, about showing people what life looks like when the person they took for granted decides to step away. Still, a part of me couldn't wait to see their faces when the truth finally came out. Because as much as I wanted peace, I also wanted them to understand the depth of the hurt they had caused me. I thought I had seen the worst of it when they branded me with that humiliating name tag, but what followed after the wedding day was even more cruel than I could have imagined. It turned out that the embarrassment I endured at that reception was only the tip of the iceberg. My granddaughter and her new husband had no interest in gratitude, respect, or even basic decency. Instead, they saw me as nothing more than a living wallet, someone to milk dry until I had nothing left to give. I began to notice the signs quickly after the wedding. Suddenly, there were constant calls not to ask how I was doing or to check in on my health, but to ask for more money. First, it was for their honeymoon expenses that apparently had run over budget. Then it was for furniture for their new home. And not just any furniture. They wanted high-end designer pieces that cost more than my first car. I wanted to be supportive, but every time I gave in, I could feel a piece of myself slipping away. I wasn't a grandmother anymore. I was a line of credit. The final straw came one evening when my granddaughter, the same little girl whose hair I used to braid and whose lunch I used to pack for school, came to me with her husband and flatly asked me to co-sign a loan for them. No warmth, no affection, just expectation. And when I hesitated, when I said I needed time to think, her husband actually smirked and said, "Come on, she's old, she doesn't need her money anyway." I can't describe the sting of those words. They cut deeper than anything else I had endured, deeper than the humiliation of the wedding day, because they revealed the truth. In their eyes, I wasn't a person anymore. I wasn't family. I was disposable, a stepping stone, someone to bleed dry until I was no longer useful. That night I sat awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every sacrifice I had made over the years. I thought about how I had sold my jewelry to pay for my daughter's education, how I had worked overtime to cover the mortgage when my husband was ill, how I had quietly skipped vacations and luxuries so that my family could have opportunities one never did. And in return I was repaid with cruelty, with selfishness, with mockery. But as painful as those realizations were, they also gave me clarity. I realized I had spent my whole life putting others first, sacrificing my happiness and security for people who never appreciated it. That was going to change. I made an appointment with my lawyer the very next morning. If my family wanted to treat me like I was nothing more than a source of money, then I would make sure they understood what life looked like without it. Over the course of the next few weeks, I restructured everything: my will, my finances, my property. The house they assumed they would inherit one day? I transferred ownership into a charitable trust. The savings account they thought they could rely on to bail them out of every bad decision? I set it aside for a scholarship fund in my late husband's name, something that would actually honor his memory instead of being wasted on luxury handbags and flashy cars. But my revenge didn't stop there. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done, to experience the humiliation and betrayal that they had so carelessly heaped upon me. So I planned my reveal carefully, waiting for the next family gathering. My granddaughter and her husband walked in that evening with the same smug expressions I had grown used to seeing, confident that they had me wrapped around their little fingers. They had no idea what was about to come. I started calmly, offering dinner and casual conversation, but halfway through the meal I placed a folder on the table. I looked my granddaughter in the eye, the same way my daughter once looked at her fiancé, and said, "Since you've made it clear what I am to you, I thought it was only fair to set things straight." Her face shifted in confusion as she opened the folder and began to read. The documents laid everything out: the trust, the scholarship fund, the new arrangements for my estate. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling, and then the realization hit her. Her husband leaned over, scanning the words, and his smug grin dissolved into pure panic. "What is this?" my granddaughter whispered, her voice cracking. I stayed firm, refusing to let their desperation sway me. This, I said, is me taking back my dignity. This is me refusing to be treated like a fool. You wanted to humiliate me, you wanted to take from me without giving anything back. But you forgot one important thing. I'm not powerless. I built this family and I can choose where my legacy goes. And it will not go to people who mock me behind my back and treat me like a burden. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I could see my granddaughter's face twist with a mixture of anger, shame, and disbelief. She tried to stammer out excuses, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that they didn't mean to hurt me, but her words felt hollow, rehearsed, and I had no interest in listening anymore. For the first time in years I felt strong. I felt free. My daughter, who had been sitting quietly until now, finally spoke. "Mom," she said softly. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I turned to her, my eyes heavy with tears I refused to let fall, and replied, "You should have realized. You should have stopped them. But you didn't." That was the hardest part. Acknowledging not just my granddaughter's betrayal but my daughter's complicity, her silence that allowed it to fester. It broke something inside me, but it also set me free from the illusion that I was valued just for being me. That night ended in chaos, with my granddaughter storming out and my daughter torn between anger and shame. But I didn't waver. For once I chose myself. For once I refused to be the victim of my own kindness. And in the quiet that followed, when the house finally emptied, I realized that revenge doesn't always have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply taking back control, refusing to let those who hurt you benefit from your sacrifice any longer. When the dust settled after the wedding, everyone thought that would be the end of the story. They assumed the humiliation had broken me, that I would just fade into the background as the old woman who had been publicly mocked by her own family. But I am not a woman who forgets or forgives easily. The truth is, the moment I saw that name tag, I realized my granddaughter, her fiancé, and even my own children had underestimated me. They thought my money made me weak, that my desire to give them the life I never had meant I would tolerate any level of disrespect. What they didn't count on was that decades of sacrifice had not made me soft. They had made me sharp, patient, and more ruthless than any of them could imagine. I let the wedding play out, smiling politely, pretending to brush off the insult, all while listening and watching. I caught my granddaughter sneering in whispers with her new husband, bragging that once I was out of the picture, they would inherit everything anyway. I saw the way her mother, my own daughter, nodded in agreement, as though she had forgotten entirely who had worked her fingers raw for years just so she could have the kind of life she now took for granted. And in that moment a strange calm washed over me. They had made a mistake. They had shown me exactly how they truly felt. And in doing so they handed me all the justification I needed to do what I had been quietly planning for years. What no one knew was that before this wedding, I had already begun shifting my estate. I had spoken to my lawyer about updating my will, and though I hadn't finalized everything, the direction was clear. My money, my home, my savings, they would not be going to ungrateful children and spoiled grandchildren who saw me only as a wallet. Instead, they would go to people who had stood by me without expecting anything in return, people who had shown me kindness in small ways when my own family could not be bothered. The caretaker who checked on me every morning, the neighbor who always shoveled my walkway without asking for a dime, the nurse who had sat with me for hours when I was sick and alone, these were the ones who would benefit from the sacrifices I made. 2 months after the wedding, I called a family meeting at my house. They arrived with smug looks, believing perhaps that I was about to hand them another check or apologize for making a scene when I expressed hurt about the name tag. Instead, I laid out folders in front of them. In those folders were copies of the new legal documents, my will, my trust, and a note addressed to each of them. I watched their faces pale as they realized none of them were inheriting a penny from me. Not my daughter, not my son-in-law, and certainly not my granddaughter who had mocked me at her own wedding. Their gasps and protests filled the room, each excuse more desperate than the last. My granddaughter even tried to cry, swearing she didn't mean it, that it was just a joke. But I remembered her laugh, her cruel eyes, and the way she whispered that I was just a bank account with wrinkles. I told them calmly that respect is not optional, that family is supposed to mean love and loyalty, not exploitation. I explained that while I had once dreamed of passing down everything to them, I no longer recognized them as the family I had sacrificed so much for. They were strangers to me now, strangers who had shown their true colors the moment they thought they had secured my money. They begged, they shouted, they even threatened, but nothing moved me. The paperwork was final, and I had already notified my attorney and financial institutions to ensure there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, word spread quickly. Friends and distant relatives called me, some in support, others in shock. But the most surprising thing was how many people, neighbors, acquaintances, even old co-workers, reached out to tell me how proud they were that I had stood up for myself. They confessed their own stories of being used, of being dismissed once they were older and no longer seen as valuable. I realized I wasn't alone. My revenge wasn't just about me. It was about proving that you cannot treat people like tools and expect no consequences. The final twist came when my granddaughter and her husband, who had counted on my money to buy a house and start their new life, found themselves drowning in debt within months. The lavish wedding had drained what little savings they had, and when bills piled up, they went to the bank for a loan. But without collateral and with no inheritance to back them, they were denied. They were forced to move into a tiny apartment, working long hours just to keep the lights on, the very life they had mocked me for enduring in my younger years. My daughter, bitter and resentful, stopped calling altogether, too ashamed to admit she had sided with greed over her own mother. Meanwhile, I found peace. My days were quieter but richer, surrounded by people who cared for me not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was. And perhaps the greatest satisfaction came not from the money I withheld, but from the lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Respect is priceless, and once it is lost, no amount of inheritance can buy it back. I didn't need to raise my voice or create a scene at that wedding. My revenge was patience, precision, and the simple act of reclaiming my dignity. In the end, I walked away with everything that mattered: self-respect, peace of mind, and the knowledge that when they called me the old lady who's paying for everything, they were right about only one thing. I was paying for everything, but not in the way they expected. I paid with wisdom and they paid with regret.